Welcome to 5 Minutes to Midnight from Liberty GB. My name is Tim Burton and I am here today to present the first in a series of videos highlighting the problems that we in the UK are experiencing with Islam. The videos are based on the premise that our freedoms, and not only our freedoms, but democracy itself, are under threat from a process of increasing Islamisation in this country. If Islam were, as Muslims often say it is, a religion of peace, then we would have very little to worry about. However, the reality is very different. Islam is primarily a totalitarian political ideology that seeks to impose itself always and everywhere, either by force and intimidation, which is why we see jihad terror on the streets of our towns and cities, or by stealth and deceit, which is why many, if not most, Muslims will do and say absolutely anything to prevent non-Muslims from getting a bad impression of Islam. It is obvious that if this situation were allowed to continue, then to put it mildly, it would not be in the best interests of the indigenous population. Several studies have shown that most of the problems that we experience due to Islam are generally in direct proportion to the percentage of the Muslim population. This is true not only in the UK, but also throughout the Western world. In the first part of 5 Minutes to Midnight, we will be examining the political nature of Islam and how the combination of an aggressive totalitarian ideology, widespread political correctness, and a craven political elite too afraid to do anything about it have produced a perfect storm. This perfect storm threatens to overthrow our most tolerant, democratic and enlightened Western societies and to impose on them a backward, barbaric, cruel and discriminatory ideology. This is an ideology that was devised in the desert environment of the Middle East in the 7th century and that has remained virtually unchanged over 1400 years to the present day. The primarily political nature of Islam is demonstrated by the fact that Islam does not follow the Golden Rule, as all other religions must if they are to be characterised as religions rather than as political ideologies. There is also the fact that 51% of the Quran is concerned not with leading Muslims on a path towards spirituality, goodness, beauty and truth, but instead concerned with instructing Muslims on how to treat non-Muslims, which is with a certain degree of ruthlessness. If this ideology is allowed to continue to spread in our Western societies in the way that it has been allowed to continue over the past 3 decades, combined with a rapidly increasing Muslim population, then within a short period of time, perhaps as little as 20 or 30 years, it will drive out democracy, destroy our freedoms and set our civilization back over 1,000 years. This is not an exaggeration, as history has shown at many different times and in many different places. The ultimate goal of Islam is a universal caliphate governed by Sharia, an all-encompassing system of laws and procedures that most people would consider completely unacceptable in a modern 21st century Western democracy. In fact, the European Court of Human Rights found in 2003 that Sharia was completely incompatible with the fundamental principles of democracy. The imposition of Sharia in the UK, which is the goal of Islam, would amount to the extinguishing of all the hard-won freedoms that our ancestors and forefathers fought for. Rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of thought and equality for all, regardless of race, creed, colour or gender. The imposition of Sharia would also take away the freedom to choose one's own religion or to have no religion at all, and even the right to proclaim one's own sexual preferences without persecution. Our primary weakness when it comes to dealing with such a subversive political ideology is that many, if not most of us, have been conditioned by political correctness to think that any and all criticism of Islam must somehow be a bad thing, and therefore something that must never be allowed to be freely discussed in public. Those of us, and not only those of us at Liberty GB, who put forward arguments against allowing Islam to flourish unrestricted, unchecked and unrestrained in a previously free society, are roundly condemned as bigoted, racist, Islamophobic and far right, even though a reasoned study of our words, employing logic and impartial critical analysis, would reveal that we are none of those things. In particular, opinions that might have been seen as moderately conservative less than 50 years ago are now maliciously labelled as far right, purely because those opinions don't fit with the prevailing left-wing narrative. Strenuous efforts are made to silence our voices and to deny us a platform anywhere in the mainstream media. Newspapers, radio and television, and even some of the prominent social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter are rapidly developing policies of censorship to suit the agenda of the left. In some cases, we are even pursued through the courts by a systematically biased criminal justice system, as I can attest to from bitter personal experience. Those Muslims who wish to advance the cause of Islam, of course, understand this self-inflicted weakness that we have allowed to develop in our tolerant and democratic society, whether through fear, ignorance, or just plain greed and self-interest by our political elites, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they take unfair advantage of it. Although they themselves claim to be victims of intolerance, of bigotry, of racism, and of so-called Islamophobia at every opportunity, the fact of the matter is that Islam is one of the most intolerant ideologies, if not the most intolerant ideology on the face of the planet. And it is our tolerance, our goodwill, and our benign and easygoing nature as non-Muslims that has allowed Islam to develop and to consolidate its position. Whenever and wherever Islam has been allowed to take control, it overtly oppresses women and non-Muslims. Moreover, there is no criticism of Islam allowed in such an environment on pain of death. Criticising Islam is considered to be blasphemy and incurs the death penalty, as does the crime of apostasy, abandoning Islam altogether. The question to be asked is, do we really want to allow such an intolerant, oppressive ideology to replace our freedoms and democracy? In the second part of 5 Minutes to Midnight, we will be discussing specific aspects of Islam which are instrumental in producing the series of increasingly unacceptable behaviours that we currently experience, including indiscriminate jihad terror, the misogynistic oppression of women and child sexual exploitation. And we will also be looking to see what, if anything, can be done about it. Welcome back to 5 Minutes to Midnight, and in part 2 we will be talking about discrimination within Islam and how it manifests itself in widespread abuse from far too many people in predominantly Muslim communities towards women and towards non-Muslims. Discrimination towards women in particular is considered to be perfectly acceptable within Islam, and this manifests itself by numerous repellent misogynistic practices towards women, including the phenomenon of honour killings, over 90% of which are committed by Muslims worldwide. There is also the appalling and widespread practice of female genital mutilation, tens of thousands of cases of which have gone mostly unpunished in the UK, and the equally appalling and equally widespread child sexual exploitation by so-called Asian grooming gangs that are in fact made up predominantly of Muslims. Because of political correctness and because of the authorities not wanting to be seen as racist or Islamophobic, the abuse of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of vulnerable young children in our society has been swept under the carpet over the past 3 decades. This has to stop now. Although we are now starting to see convictions for abuse of this nature, one of the most recent set of convictions involved a so-called Asian grooming gang in Newcastle, once again made up predominantly of Muslims. The widespread nature of this phenomenon suggests that we have only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. Similar gangs have been shown to be operating in Rotherham, Rochdale, Sheffield, Oxford, Telford, Birmingham, and in many other towns and cities in the UK. Things have reached the point where, if one thinks that they haven't got this problem in their town or city, then they are probably not looking hard enough. The mainstream media has gone out of its way to portray these crimes as having been carried out by Asians. But in reality, the perpetrators are mostly Muslim. This, of course, is a casual act of racism by the mainstream media against Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and every other Asian person who is non-Muslim. One of the worst aspects of this appalling practice is that slavery, and particularly sex slavery in the form of child sexual exploitation, is also perfectly acceptable within Islam and has been so for 1400 years. One can point to many instances in the Quran and also in the Hadith and the Sirah, which are the other equally important Islamic texts, where the Islamic prophet Muhammad is narrated to have kept slaves, including sex slaves. Muslims regard Muhammad as the perfect man who is an eternal role model for all Muslims and whose behaviour and motives are never to be questioned, which goes a long way to explaining why we have the problems we do. The characteristics of such an eternal role model are likely to be emulated unthinkingly by many, if not most Muslims, not least because self-reflection is not encouraged by Islamic teachings. It also goes a long way to explaining why, although the mainstream media call this an Asian problem, such systematic abuse in the form of child sexual exploitation is almost never, if ever, seen in Hindu communities, Buddhist communities, or Sikh communities. As we have said, the perpetrators are mostly Muslim, and the situation is made worse by the fact that most, if not all, of the victims are non-Muslim. The mainstream media also tends to focus on the fact that most, if not all, of the victims are, coincidentally, white. And there have been strenuous attempts in the media to portray this as a problem of racism, rather than to lay the blame where it rightly belongs, which is squarely on the shoulders of the political ideology of Islam. We'd like to strongly emphasise at this point that at Liberty GB we have no intention of inciting hatred against Muslim communities or even against individual Muslims. And we absolutely condemn any form of vigilantism, which is counterproductive as it plays straight into the hands of the left-wing narrative. It would be better by far if the relevant authorities consigned political correctness to the dustbin of history, which would then allow them to take immediate, decisive and effective action concerning the uncontrolled spread of the political ideology of Islam. It would be far better if Muslims confronted head-on the violence and misogyny inherent in the Quran and in the example of Muhammad, the perfect man. It would be better still if Muslims communities in the UK were to comprehensively, transparently and unreservedly commit themselves to cooperating with the authorities to uncover the grooming gangs. It would be infinitely better if imams were to comprehensively, transparently and unreservedly teach in every mosque that such behaviour is unacceptable in any civilised society. But for all this to happen, Muslims must acknowledge that there are larger problems within Islam itself that must be addressed if Muslims and non-Muslims are ever to coexist in peace and harmony, and to coexist as equals in perpetuity. No community will tolerate for long the sustained and systematic abuse of their children by those to whom they have extended their hospitality. To continually assert that there are no problems within Islam and that everything is just fine and hunky-dory will be catastrophic for us all in the long term. As history has shown us in many times, in many different places, if the numerous problems within Islam remain unaddressed, then rapidly increasing Muslim demographics will undoubtedly lead to more strife, intercommunity tensions and ultimately civil war on our streets. You think it can't happen here? Think again. It is literally 5 minutes to midnight. However, it doesn't have to be this way. We at Liberty GB are committed to making every non-Muslim in the UK aware of the reality of the current situation, rather than perpetuating the politically correct fantasy that the authorities would like us to continue to believe. Please join us and help us to stop the Islamisation of the UK. Your support can make an enormous and positive difference to the future of this country, to the future of our children and grandchildren, and to generations of children yet unborn. Sign up to Liberty GB today, or make a contribution to our cause via the big red button on our website. You can find us at www.libertygb.org.uk. This has been Tim Burton on behalf of Liberty GB, and I would like to thank you for watching this presentation. Thank you.